our next talk is around security. So Lapa, what does zero trust mean to you?
Zero trust. I didn't know the term zero trust up until 2 months ago, and I happened to have a podcast with people from HashiCorp and Eficode where they had a conversation, and I was happy to facilitate that conversation. What I do remember was trust no one, authenticate everything, and assume breach. So those were the 3 things around zero trust. But we are going to learn more about that, because now we have people, Sayar from HashiCorp and Rickard Löfström from Telia, and they are going to talk about zero trust security.
Hi everybody, good morning. I'm Guy. Welcome to our session. I'm the Field CTO at HashiCorp here in Europe, and today I have Rickard with me, Cloud Architect at Telia. Very excited to come and talk about those 3 things that you mentioned before, right? The trust no one, authenticate everything, and assume breach. And we'll kind of we'll have a different session today, kind of a different tweak. So I'll start with a quick intro of HashiCorp for those who are not familiar with HashiCorp, then overview on zero trust, our strategy, approach, philosophy to zero trust. The next part will be a discussion between me and Rickard about security and implementing zero trust at a Telia company. And at the very end, we left 10 minutes for Q&A, but please feel free to use the time and kind of put questions in the chat. And also we'll have 2 poll questions throughout the discussion. Try to keep it a little bit interactive. So with that, I'll start. HashiCorp, for those who are not familiar with us, we build tools for practitioners to help them transition to a multi-cloud, deploy and run applications in a multi-cloud environment. You can kind of think about our tool set in 4 different categories: infrastructure, network management, security, and application management. And there are 3 main areas that I kind of just want to touch upon very quickly. The first is our community and how we enable and invest in the community. So each and every one of our products is available as an open source. You can just download, use it, get support from the community for free. And then we kind of build on that to enable enterprises to create enterprise-grade solutions and platforms using the HashiStack. And the third kind of pillar that I want to mention is our ecosystem and partners. So one of our principles is kind of think workflows and not technologies. And this is where we leverage and integrate and enrich the partner ecosystem, both from an integration perspective, but also from a delivery and an operational perspective. So that's kind of a little bit about HashiCorp. We are a public company listed very late last year. And the next bit is I want to kind of throw in a question about a poll question to the audience, and that is, tell us about your cloud strategy. It's a multi-choice question, so you don't have to enter text. Just select your strategy. Take your time, and I'll kind of move on and talk about. I'll talk about some other things, and we'll come back to the poll questions or the result. So while you do that, I want to maybe touch a little bit on the problem space, the problem domain where HashiCorp operates. And really, this slide is condensed into one slide. I'm trying to show here this transition from traditional homegrown data centers and operational model to a multi-cloud environment. We do work with a lot of cloud-first small companies that don't have the traditional, existing IT infrastructure. But the problem is much harder or significantly, larger when you think about moving from a static privately owned, highly controlled, with very intimate knowledge of everything and anything, to an environment where you now work with multiple cloud providers. And if we kind of break it to the different layers, and you can think about each cloud provider by its own, provide services. And if you joined the session earlier from GitLab, you'll have a lot of tools, right? More tools to integrate with Azure and AWS and Google and Alibaba, and you still have your on-prem infrastructure, and then all of a sudden you have this huge amount of technology stack and processes and practices that you need to reason with as an organization. And this is where HashiCorp kind of fits in, and we kind of have a story for each layer of this multi-cloud operational challenge, right? The complexity and the burden that comes with operating in a multi-cloud. There's a lot of benefits that come from multi-cloud, and we kind of know that all organizations with high confidence are multi-cloud, will be multi-cloud if they are not, today, due to organic growth. It could be a different technology or different capability or different region that the cloud provider offers, or it could just be non-organic acquisition or merger, and then all of a sudden you have multiple clouds that you need to reason with. So the problem is there, and then how do you work in that diverse environment? We call it the cloud operating model, and for each of the layers we have a solution. We have a tool, and we'll talk about kind of moving from tools to capabilities, but think about the Hashi stack as solving the provisioning, the infrastructure, the security, the identity and security strategy, and the networking in a single consistent control plane that we call it the cloud operating model. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview on us, on HashiCorp, and where we fit in before we zoom into Zero Trust. And I need to see, I'm not sure how to see the results actually. Let me try and get the results. Oh, I need to answer the poll myself. Oh, fair enough. Fair enough. So I'm going to say, yes, I am multi-cloud. Okay, great. So I see roughly 47% are hybrid, both on-prem and public clouds. Interesting. So that's kind of half of the population, roughly. 20% are just using native tools. Okay, fair enough. We'll also talk about that a little bit. And 32% use tools that abstract and use most hyperscaler. Yeah, I think it's a good breakout. Okay, cool. So I'll move on and now start our main course, which is the Zero Trust. So this is going to be high level, quick overview of where we see zero trust and where we fit in. And naturally, we fit in the data center and the application kind of area or domain. And Zero Trust spans multiple areas that we don't cover, like the supply chain and secure development strategy, securing end user devices, and so on. So we naturally, because where we are, I'll talk about securing the data centers and applications in the data center. And I'll kind of take a step back. We start, going back to my initial slides of where we fit. We start with organizations that have secured and built security practices and tools over the years for on-premises data center, right? And it was easy to secure in the sense that there was this castle and moat mental model, and the operating assumption is that everything that is inside the data center is good, everything outside the network everything inside the data center on the network is good, trusted. Everything outside is bad and not trusted. And then with that model, you kind of, you have physical control on the building, on the hardware, on the appliances, on the middleware, on the network, shim layers and firewalls and WAFs, kind of to control the ingress and to kind of make sure that no bad actor makes it into the highly trusted network. And then inside the highly trusted network, security was a little bit sloppy. I should say, maybe not sloppy, but kind of, applications relied on the fact that someone else secures the perimeter, right? And with this strategy, it's okay to be a little bit more flexible when it comes to operating in a secure environment. And then kind of cloud came in and changed that picture completely. And I want to touch on the three main perspectives. The first is that understanding of the perimeter, right? We talked about physical control, physical layers, hardware, and appliances, and think about leveraging, integrating, consuming network and compute from public cloud providers. You no longer, as an IT organization, you no longer have control on specifying and managing the low-level networking gear. You don't kind of take a firewall and ship it to Amazon and say, this is my firewall and I want to manage it. But you kind of specify your intent and let the cloud provider manage and control the underlying infrastructure. And it doesn't stop there. If you think of kind of the transition that happens from private to public, you'll always have applications and data that will remain on-prem. Some will migrate, and new applications, hopefully, typically you start in the cloud, and now all of a sudden you have this requirement for connectivity and access from public cloud, low trust, zero trust environment to your very private, highly trusted, highly controlled data center, right? So there's no, our approach to zero trust is that perimeter that protected your homegrown private data centers and applications can no longer be relied on. There's no, we call it the perimeterless strategy. Then the second point is, again, going back to the previous session from GitLab, if you joined, this focus on user workflows, self-service, agility, application teams operate self-sufficiently and kind of, manage their own destiny. And then in that model, security reviews, scanning, pen tests, whatever it is that is implemented for the application can no longer happen as a gate at the end of the process, as it is in the waterfall kind of slow-moving strategy and applications. Right. So now you are in a low trust environment, but you don't want the security teams and cyber to interfere and slow down delivery and agility of applications. And the third one is, this very assumption that people are on the network, they should be there, and we trust them. When I say people, I mean, actors, right? Systems and applications and operators as well. The fact that they're on the network should not give them access to anything, right? We assume attacker is on the network. And if you assume an attacker is on the network, then your whole strategy for securing everything from your code base all the way to your application runtime changes, because you know that you have bad actors on the network. So these are kind of the three main things that changed. And, kind of going back to the, how do you change? What do you do to change and work in that environment? So the first is trust no one, right? Authenticate and authorize. Every interaction needs to start with some form of authentication authorization. And you no longer kind of rely on physical identity. You can no longer rely on IP addresses and ports as it was with static homegrown private data centers, firewall rules, load balancers that are all IP and MAC addresses specific. Going back to our network, the network is no longer uniform. IP addresses will be patched and replaced, and some NATs middlewares will hide identities. So a new form of identity needs to be thought of, some logical identity, and every interaction between any two actors must begin with authenticate and authorize the flow before allowing access. The second is the just-in-time secrets. And then this is a spectrum, and thinking of, static, one-time secrets that you kind of have on a Post-it note and you share between your team, all the way to secrets. And when I say secrets in the general sense, it's API keys, certificates, and so on. Think about those being created ephemerally on demand for one-time use. Right? That's kind of the nirvana state. But moving from, and the journey is moving from, we'll go more into details when we talk with Rickard, but moving from static secrets in your code, in the config, to moving them into a centralized wallet that is managed, and then this notion of dynamic secrets, dynamic credentials, and ephemeral identities as well. And then the third point is encrypt everything, right? And this is where traditional transparent disk encrypt solutions, right, that work in a static, local, highly trusted environment, they can no longer satisfy our attacker on the network, because if attacker is on the network, they will access the database, and then the transparent disk encrypt that is part of the infrastructure will happily decrypt the data, right? So we now need to think about encrypting everything and elevating the encryption from being done transparently to being done at the application level, and with the application controlling the encryption, writing and reading encrypted data, and sending encrypted data on the wire. And then this is kind of three main areas that help organization transition to a zero trust environment, right? And it's a journey. And my next poll question is, tell us about your zero trust journey, and kind of how you manage the problem where you are. Oh, look at this, zero struts, nice. And then I'm going to also answer before I move on, so I can have the results. And I'm going to say that I'm implementing zero trust. Why not? All right, I'll wait for a few results to come in.
Hi, we are Eficode, and we organize the DevOps conference. We think that DevOps solves the conflict between security and the rate of innovation. If you are burdened by compliance, regulation, and red tape, we would love to talk and help you with your next steps. You can find us at eficode.com. The links are in the description. And have a great time with the DevOps conference talks.
And then I'll talk a little bit about our, how we solve zero trust with a set of tools. So we looked at the spectrum of tools, 8 or so tools, main tools. A few are incubating, and then for zero trust specifically, we kind of look at these 3 tools from HashiCorp. And the overarching idea here is moving from the notion of physical identity to logical identity, from physical controls to logical identity controls, right? And then you will see that the details, I'll briefly touch on each of these boxes. At the details, it's slightly different, and this is why we use different technologies for human to machine and machine to machine. But then if you think about, each of, so I'll kind of start from outside and walk in. For human to machine, the identity and authorization, we just kind of integrate with single sign-on. We don't solve the problem. For machine to machine, we use Vault. Vault is our leading security product, and it does a few things. In the context of zero trust, think about the secrets management, but also the identity brokering. So kind of think about many different systems, microservices, and the number of identities and secrets kind of exploded, right? So you have a lot of things that you need to be aware of and manage. And identity brokering is where Vault application authenticates with a well-known identity against Vault, and then Vault would broker and introduce that identity dynamically to the target environment. Then if we move in, access, right, machine-to-machine access is what we do with Consul. So Consul solves the machine-to-machine access. It's a modern application-level, service-level networking tool. It solves the service mesh problem. There's also a very nice integration between Consul and Terraform to kind of complete the last mile of automation in the context of zero trust. And it secures the interaction between services. Human-to-machine access, this is Boundary. It's a new tool. It's available as an open source only at the moment. And it kind of creates a new workflow for PAM, for privileged access management. And the principle of Boundary is only to create a secure channel on demand from an end user workstation to a resource ephemerally. Unlike traditional jump host and VPN keys and so on, Boundary solves this problem dynamically for a low trust environment. So that's kind of an overview of our three main tools that we use to implement zero trust. Again, the overarching principle here is moving away from physical and static to logical identities and dynamic controls. And then I just want to look at the zero trust, the zero trust results. I think by far not too bad. So I have 38%. Not ready yet to start zero trust. Okay, interesting. We can talk about that. How to start, right? But I see that some have already started and are struggling with kind of the extending or scaling and migrating different teams in the organization into the zero trust, which is a significant challenge in IT generally speaking, right? It's also a point that we'll touch upon. Thank you for that. Right. Okay. So now let me invite Rickard as well to join us, and we'll kind of do a little bit of a chat. I have a few questions that we kind of wanted to brainstorm on. But first, Rickard, hi. Thank you. I kind of introduced you earlier, but why don't you take a minute or two just to tell us a little bit about Telia company for those who are not familiar with it, and where you fit in, what you do, what your team does within Telia.
Yeah, I would be happy to do that, Guy. So Telia company is the largest Nordic carrier. So most of our services are, in mobile and media, and we span the Nordic countries and the Baltics. So of course, complexities, and as you talked about earlier, with acquisitions, with adoptions, the landscape becomes more complicated to ensure, this smooth experience. So, and that's where my team comes in. So I work in the cloud platform engineering team. So we help to try to soften the blow of moving into a multi-cloud environment. And a lot of those technologies that you talked about are within the domain that my team then provides, and work, with security, with network, to try to give this, holistic and golden path approach. So that team can have, the velocity that they need, because as you said earlier, if we look at the polls, there are significant struggles to move into this direction. Just the tool itself is not enough, but you also have to bring in, the zero trust tenets, and this way of thinking into the organization.
Yes, yeah, that's a very good point, and I think maybe it's a good segue to even touch on the survey result, right? A lot of people who haven't started yet, 37% haven't started yet. That's a lot, and maybe if you could kind of describe briefly, like, your journey, where you are in the journey, where you are, and how you start this zero trust program.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have a slide on that to show, the journey. So if we can bring that up. So a lot of this comes from, trying to shift the organization into a flow, right? So as you talked about, finding the enablement needs, like why do we need zero trust? Building that use case and getting a momentum in the organization where there are, where you have the backing, from management to get this started. And it can be a small thing, right? And then, of course, we picked, in this case, we built secret management as the target, to align on. So, you can start small. And I think that's something that people forget, just having one team or one service adopting this goes miles beyond any PowerPoint or conference page. And you talked about organizational difficulties. Well, I think it's important to train, like this. You can't just bring the tools, you need to make them a capability, something that people use, right? Because as you said, the tools are to a certain degree, free and available. It's just that, you need to master the tooling and start with something. And that's where I think the community that you talked about, the open source community, the plugins, the available tool set and practices that exist, that's where they come in hand. And then I think it's just about, like this conference, talking about this, building excitement, building an interest, and then of course measure, understand where's the traction, how do we get these applications onboarded to Vault, for example, and then it's just rinse and repeat. And I think you can get a lot of interesting insights from conversations like you and I have now. Guy are talking to other people how they are adopting, because every organization is unique, right? So there's no proven path here. It's complex, right? And it's mostly about the organization, because the technology is not the limiting factor here. Don't you agree, Guy? It's more about building the momentum.
Yeah, totally. I think you said it nicely in one of our meetings, that how you separate, or how you distinguish between the tool and the capability. Like, there are so many tools, but making a capability for the organization from a set of tools is a different type of challenge, right? And this is something that will be unique to every organization. And you started with the secret management. It's typical to start with secret management. So in terms of your deployment, are you kind of going back to our polls and trying to think about where Telia is with that? Are you multi-cloud? You have on-prem and multiple cloud, hybrid clouds, and how did you and then also I'll bundle in the second question. Where did you start? Where did you start? With practices, with the teams, with where, like, on-prem, off-prem, which tools did you use and how? Maybe kind of extend on these two.
Yeah, absolutely. So Telia, of course, has a number of data centers and has a history of that. So we're heavily on-prem, but we also been working with AWS even as far as 2017. So we have a large presence. We have over 880 developers, over 370 AWS accounts. So there's a large momentum, and that pulls into Google Cloud. I think we have roughly 170 projects in Google Cloud, and then around 50 to 60 subscriptions in Azure. So there's a momentum, and it further complicates things that we're located in different countries, and with regulations and compliance, you have even further demarcation lines on-prem. So it's a complex environment, but having a tool that's native, that you can learn and use and span across clouds, doesn't put you in a situation where you still can't have this harmony, this developer experience where everyone speaks the same language. And that's why we've invested in Vault and have that available throughout our countries and spanning into the public clouds to get that holistic experience.
Yeah, and I think one plug, right? Both Vault and Terraform, most of our products are very conscious of the fact that there is an estate, there is a set of partner technologies and ecosystem that we integrate with, even to the point where there's a large. I just heard yesterday about a large deployment in APAC that are doing dynamic secrets on DB2 from IBM, which is a 40-year-old database, right? It's not just the new, it's also the existing and how to get to the new.
Exactly.
I want to see.
And that's where we see. Yeah, exactly.
I just want to see if there's any question from the audience. I have, we can go on, right? I have so many questions for you, but I just want to see if we have questions before we continue.
Yes, I think we have a question here. Like, how do we persuade developer teams and management if they don't see the value in zero trust? I think we can talk a little about the velocity, right? If you know where the secrets are, if you can auto provision and rotate them, it's not only about security, it's about streamlining the experience. I think anyone can understand that deployments are faster if you have a proven path, right? So I think that should be. But how do you guide then when you talk with other businesses? Like, where do people feel that they get on this zero trust train? Where
totally. And I think I'll just extend on what you said, because I totally agree with what you said. And this notion of move fast and break things, which works for some organization, it doesn't really work for large enterprises, specifically in the context of security. So you think about the requirements of zero trust, or the requirements of security they are not an experience or efficiency for the application for developers. They are there to protect the organization, to make sure that all stakeholders, customers, partners, employees, and the organization itself can operate safely. And traditionally, you would do that, sequentially, waterfall, people reviewing and approving, and pen testing and all that, which creates a delay, a significant delay sometimes, right, to applications moving fast. So moving fast without breaking things, the way to do it is to implement guardrails and controls automated into the process, the SDLC pipelines and the runtime practices, the data governance, the communication, the identity, all those areas that make an application occur. If you implement and automate guardrails, then you kind of, you don't need to suffer those delays and penalties of making sure that you're operating safely and securely, right? That's kind of how it's not really an enabler, but it's a facilitator to make sure that application teams can keep delivering, right? Can keep moving fast without breaking things. And we see it, one large American bank, they kind of said, we are now building an automated cyber review check that will save 3 weeks for every release of an application. And they took the time to implement it, and this is on one of the large cloud providers on Amazon, and it's now fully automated. So imagine kind of the 3 weeks delay to now be in 10, 15, 20 minutes of execution and automation that runs, right? That's I don't know of any application team that wouldn't like to do that.
No, and I think it's about tuning the product, right? And I think that's what if you look at another slide, where we have this secret management portal. So we work a lot with educating both management, architects, and developers. I'm not sure. Can we get that on the screen and talk about this? The internet page that we built.
Try. I think this one, right? This one?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So in Telia, we try to communicate the aspects that you talk about, like communicating what this brings to the company in terms of, of course, compliance, but then also the benefits it gives in terms of the velocity that team can build. And I see we had a question about what tools Telia uses for zero trust. Yeah, it's here where we communicate. We give a holistic picture of what this, this is where we move the tool to a capability, right? Give people these guardrails, tell them about this. And wouldn't you agree to a large extent, to understand the benefits of zero trust, you have to understand the concept and then introspect into your organization. And to do that, there are learning that needs to happen. We need to move into this direction and be more informed, because it's hard to just point at a tool and there's no magic wand here, right? This is as much a technical capability as it is an organizational shift.
Totally agree. It's taking the tool, making a tool into a capability is an organizational challenge, with education, with structure, with bottom up evangelism and change agents and top down support. The full story.
I think
we still have time. Do you see more questions? I don't have the panel of questions with me.
Yeah, I got one here. What tools that Telia use to implement zero trust? Well, I think obviously, Vault is one candidate. We're also looking at different overlays like Consul, because as an organization, we have a bunch of firewalls, we have a bunch of central teams, and that bogs stuff down, with manual improvements and the insight. I mean, who's best positioned to protect an application? Well, that's likely the team that builds it. And having them aware of the constructs. We use a lot of Terraform, so we have a lot of understanding, and this programmatic approach to access is very natural to us. But again, it's more about positioning the tool. So we have another question here. A concrete example of impact of zero trust. Well, I mean, in this case,
example
we
of?
haven't. Yeah, they want to ask about a practical example here. So I can give one from Telia.
Yeah, go ahead.
We have this identity platform, where people register their applications. That team struggles with giving out credentials, and they want to be able to rotate that in terms of a leak, or make sure that they are being rotated. By integrating with Vault and pushing their secrets to a central repository, in this case a namespace, or to other teams' namespaces, they are more in control of the supply chain of their credentials. It doesn't end up on a consultant's laptop. It's not being kept out of date, because there would be a manual process to push that into production. So it's more of a reactive approach. I mean, and in the sense, they're delivering access as a service. And I think that's, again, not having this thing. I mean, imagine, in today's day, when you need to rotate SSL certificates and they only live for 1 year. I mean, that's the kind of
totally. And you get an email that it expires, and you have so many of these, and what expires when, and yes, totally. I just want to very quickly go back to your point earlier. That I want to do a quick plug for a very nice integration between Consul and Terraform. Super nice integration, and this is also an example. A large UK bank that automated the last mile of network connectivity, and kind of took it from 3 months of ticket-based firewalls and load balancer interaction with the network infrastructure team to a few minutes of automation. And think about it very, very briefly. Terraform, because of the plugin strategy or the provider strategy, can talk with anything on the planet, right? Specifically, any network device. It doesn't have the application awareness, the runtime knowledge of what is happening in the estate. If you put Consul above it, that manages the service discovery with health awareness when processes come and go, when machines come and go for scale or failure. If you now combine the two, and Terraform listens to events from Consul to then poke a hole in the firewall or update the load balancer, you kind of completed the last mile of the network automation, which remains still a significant challenge for most organizations. It's new, but it's a great capability. I just wanted to kind of go back to that point.
Yeah, I think that's a great concept. I mean, you and I will be available. We have this booth, right? So if you want to hear more information, about what Telia is doing, or more great examples of how businesses can use this, I think, Guy, we will be available and to have a chat. And
please feel free. I mean, I think the time is up, but please feel free to chat with us. We'll stay at the booth. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Guy.
Rickard.
Thank you, Rickard. I think you nailed 3 things for us. One, you kept the time. You look at the questions yourself, and then you told the audience where to find you after that. So it was absolutely fantastic conversation. Thank you for that.